objectives. The title of John's speech is Things You Never Knew About Spanish. He studied in Spain and he has done volunteer work in Mexico. His goal today is to inform you of some interesting things you may not know about the Spanish language. Please join me in welcome to the lecturer, John Clevenger.
Thank you, Toastmaster Williams, and welcome to our guest today. As she said, the purpose of my speech today is to tell you a few things that you may not know about the Spanish language. And in keeping with my two previous speakers, I'll start by asking a question. Is there anyone here who speaks Spanish fairly fluently? Okay, then to you, I'll apologize in advance because I will mention a few slang words that won't be offensive to anyone in the room, but it will be you. So as I said, my purpose in this speech is to tell you a few interesting things that you may not know. Of course, I'm not going to try to explain the grammar of the language or anything like that in this time period. As Cynthia said, I studied in Spain twice, studying the grammar, and then I volunteered in Mexico for 5 months at a nonprofit. And along the way, I just learned all kinds of interesting facts about the Spanish language and how it's different from English. And I want to share with you a few of those things today. So I've divided this talk into 3 areas. The first is a little about the history and the background of the linguistics of the language. The second is just a few interesting things about the grammar. And lastly, how language is a reflection of the culture of a country. So first, a little history and one fact. There are about 500 million people in the world that speak Spanish. And I didn't know until recently, researching this, that there are now more Spanish speakers in the US than there are in Spain, which I don't think that's probably pleasing to Spaniards because they really do take pride that their country is the origin of the language. And of course, you know, it is spoken in many countries in Latin America. So there are 2 different types of Spanish in general. The Spanish that's spoken in Spain is often referred to as Castilian, whereas Latin American Spanish is simply called Spanish. And in Spain, because there are so many different languages, like in Barcelona, they speak Catalan. And that's not a dialect of Spanish, it's one of the Romance languages. If people refer to Spanish as Spanish, that would be offensive to someone who lives in Spain, but because they also consider Catalan to be Spanish. So they use this word Castilian to describe that. And there are several other languages in Spain. And if you studied Spanish in school, you probably pronounced things in the way that people do in Latin America. For example, the C sound is like a C in English. The word patience is spelled pretty much like patience here, but with 2 C's. It's paciencia. In Spain, they have what sounds like a lisp. The C sound and the Z sound is a th, so it's paciencia. That's the way traditional Spaniards pronounce their letters. And there are different ideas about where that came from. It's not really agreed upon in linguistics, but some people think that it's the King Ferdinand, who was one of the sponsors of Christopher Columbus, that he had a lisp. And some people say that because people who were in his company didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable, that they would just speak with a lisp so that it didn't alienate him, and then it sort of caught on. And that's sort of just a tale, but there are lots of people who believe things like that. So I'll also mention a few differences in the vocabulary that people use in Spain and in other countries. Like in Spain, if you refer to a seashell, it's the word concha. But in several other countries, that's very offensive. And the word pinche is an obscenity in Mexico, as AK is grinning and evidence that that's a dirty word. But it's funny that that word means bobby pin for a woman's hair in Puerto Rico, and the word means stingy in Nicaragua. And in Spain, that word is for a chef's assistant. Those are so different. And it's just funny that it can mean all those things and still just be an obscenity in Mexico. And lastly, of course, accent can vary among all these different countries. But in Spain even, there are many different accents, just as there are in the United States. And when I was there, I studied in different parts. And in the southern state called Andalusia, the accent was totally different than the rest of Spain. I lived with a family of gypsies, actually. The gypsy is their race. But everyone in that state spoke in the way Cubans do. They basically don't say S's in any of their words, even if they're plural, which is what you normally would do. So it's very different. And so now I'm going to speak on grammar for just a second. I know it's a subject that was wildly interesting to you when you were in school, but one thing that I think helps us sort of appreciate how difficult it is for any immigrant that comes to the United States is, for example, Spanish speakers are used to their verbs only end in one of three ways. Of the thousands of verbs in their language, they all either end in AR, ER, or IR. And if you think for just a second about our language, like to say to eat and to drink end totally differently, to swallow, to digest, those verbs all end totally differently. And that's the case. We have hundreds of different endings. So, I mean, that's sort of illustrates why it's so frustrating for people that move here and try to learn English well, quickly. And lastly, Spanish is actually spoken almost exactly the way it's written. And English, that's not the case. We have so many silent letters. Like in the word island, there's a silent S. And the word column or autumn, there's a silent N. And there's so many things like that that can be really frustrating for anyone who moves here. So I think that sort of helps illustrate the tall order for anyone who has to learn English or any other second language. And the last part of my talk is about how language really reflects the culture of the people that speak it. And one example is in Mexico, we know that the chili pepper is really prevalent in their food, and it's really part of their culture. And it's in all the cuisine. And so they have phrases like medium chili. If you wanted to say I'm tipsy, you would say I'm medium chili-ish. This thing's odd, and of course you know that there is some machismo in the Spanish culture and Latin American culture, and one reflection of that is that if there's a slang word that has the word padre in it, which means father, it's always positive. Like if something's muy padre, it means really cool. And if a word has madre in it for mother, it's negative. It's like if you say something is a desmadre, it means it's a big mess. And there are other examples of that. And of course, there are so many idioms that are part of our language. And these are phrases that the meaning of the phrase is not the same as the literal meaning of the words. And that also is a reflection of our culture. One example in English is if something's really expensive, we say it cost me an arm and a leg. And for really the same meaning, in Mexico they say it cost me one eye from my face. Another interesting thing about idioms is that there's usually some historical root or origin. And there's one phrase in Spain that goes back to their civil war. They had a terrible civil war in the 1930s, and the food shortage was so bad that it gave birth to a phrase that says, when you're the father, you'll eat the egg. And that is, if a household is lucky enough to maybe have one egg, I guess it went to the man who was maybe out doing manual labor all day. So these days, if a kid says, "Oh, Mom, I want that Nintendo game or something," and she says, "Well, when you're the father, you'll have the egg." And I think it's interesting that it goes back to their Civil War. It's not just random. So I will end with that and say that I hope that you will remember a few of these little facts about Spanish and maybe share them with other people that you know. Thank you.